Howdy. My name is Terry Robinson, and you may know me from Mage the Podcast. In early 2020, I was part of a group of content creators and storyteller vault writers who ran a community survey about the World of Darkness just to kind of figure out what was going on. This is my slideshow on the results. So I have no idea how long this PowerPoint thing is going to be, so I figure I'll start out with key findings. That way, if you're like, I only want to watch 3 minutes and not look at all your math, Mr. Robinson, that's totally cool. Takeaways. Vampire the Masquerade, by far the most popular line, he said to the surprise of no one. Roughly 2 times the players of the next leading line, which is going to be Werewolf or Mage, depending on who you ask. They're kind of neck and neck, and almost twice as many buyers as the next line. Now, something you may not have anticipated, Demon the Fallen, surprisingly popular of all the books that did not get a 20th anniversary release. One of the key questions we kind of asked is what predicts whether or not someone is going to buy a book? And we looked at players who rated themselves as playing, not playing, interested in, and unable to find a group for a game. And it turned out that the people who most reliably bought a book in a line are those who just listed themselves as interested. The next key finding was non-vampire lines have a huge amount of latent demand, and we'll get into latent demand later, but latent demand is the idea that someone is interested in a game and has either not been able to find a group or looked for a group and wasn't able to find one. So it includes both people who have actively looked and those who haven't. The average World of Darkness player is older and more male than the average D&D player. We can take all sorts of conclusions from that if we want to. And that, to my STV author friends, players seem to be reliably looking for books that include new powers or summaries of existing powers, play aids to make the game experience easier, and location books as being highly desired versus other things like fiction, art assets, pre-constructed characters, and so on. But now that we've done the key conclusions up front, let's do a little bit more about what we actually did. So Josh Heath, Charles Siegel, and I came up with an initial survey of World of Darkness gamers to try and find out what people were actually playing. We have a lot of online arguments that say, this game's more popular than that game. And for the longest time, the best we could do is kind of look at relative community sizes or look at medal counts on Drive-Thru RPG. And we wanted to both know who's playing what and how does that relate to their purchases. Why? Well, we were kind of curious in that both play patterns and purchase patterns are going to give you an idea of who wants more stuff. We were all authors on the Storyteller Vault, which is the content portal for community content provided by White Wolf, and it helps us figure out what we should focus on. Additionally, for me, I'm a huge Mage the Ascension fan. I do Mage the Podcast. If I can find out what helps make new players, I'm going to find that to be useful information. And if I can provide those tools and help grow my community, I'm going to consider that to be a win. Another question was, what is the latent desire existing in the World of Darkness lines? Latent desire are people who want to try a game but haven't had a chance. And that could be because they couldn't find a group, or they couldn't convince their players to do it, or even if they haven't looked. These are theoretically the future of all of our communities, so it kind of helps to have an idea of who they are and what kind of predicts what is going to help someone actually put their butt in a seat and play a game. To get the word out, we came up with the survey and started sharing links to it. We tried to cast our net as wide as we could and shared it on every Facebook group, Discord, and web forum that we could find that was tied to the World of Darkness and the old World of Darkness. And we reached out to something shy of about 60 of them, which seems pretty good, but considering there's probably 150 groups alone on like Nepalese cooking or something like that, there was probably a lot more work we could do in that regard. This method likely biases the sample towards the most adamant fans, as those are the ones most likely to be in one or more online communities. We don't know if most World of Darkness purchases are made by a small number of very committed fans or by a large number of lightly engaged fans, and the survey is likely going to be biased towards that former group. We have no idea what the total market scale is. We just don't have access to that information. I did some digging and I could get some rough numbers from the early 2000s through trade bodies, but that's just not information I have. If White Wolf or Onyx Path wants to share that, by all means, I'd love to. We could compare notes. There's likely a bias towards World of Darkness as compared to Chronicles of Darkness, just because we had more reach into the World of Darkness communities. Chronicles of Darkness was also surveyed in this, but rather than having one incredibly long presentation, I'm breaking it up into two. So overall, what did we ask? First of all, we are not demographers or social scientists. I'm an actuary. I had help from a computer scientist and a guy with a background in international conflict resolution. So if you're yelling at your screen that we asked stupid questions and that we should have never done this in the first place, I'm sorry. We wanted to focus on things that were relatively actionable and recent. If somebody hasn't played in decades and they don't buy things, we're not really curious what they have to say. Just because unless we have good information on what gets someone active again, we are much more interested in knowing what current consumers and those who are interested in making new purchases are going to make, as well as people who are actively seeking to participate in role-playing games or who are in role-playing games. We also asked, what have you played or run in the past year within the World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness lines? Next time we may ask about other games. What do you want to run or play in the last year but couldn't because you either weren't able to find players or weren't able to find a storyteller? What game supplements did you buy for World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness in the last year? We asked this for both official publications through Modiphius, The Onyx Path, and White Wolf, as well as community content through the Storyteller Vault. We asked, what kind of supplements would you like to see produced? We broke this down into a few categories, which we'll talk about later. We also asked if you are interested in LARPing, which is live action role playing, how it relates to your tabletop playing, and what kind of game related media would you like to see, whether that be formally from the companies or from communities. We also asked if people wanted to participate in Storyteller Vault, as well as what people think about how well WAD does regarding representation. There's also a bunch of stuff that we didn't ask. We did ask some basic demographic information, but I felt uncomfortable asking for stuff like household income and such. Again, I am technically what's known as some guy on the internet, and if somebody starts asking you that stuff, I certainly feel uncomfortable. Maybe next time that'll let us do different insights, and maybe we'll ask about that. We also wanted to keep the survey short. The extinction rate, which is the number of people who BS their way through the last few questions by giving everything 1s or 5s, was pretty low, so I think we did a good job of not making it excessively long. We also didn't ask about other gameplay or other gaming experience outside of the previous year, just because we don't really trust people's memories. If we were to do it again, I would probably say something like, since V20 was released, or something like that. So, of the people who clicked on the link, there were about 1,200 who clicked on the initial link, and about 1,100 responded, which I think is great. Again, this is not my bailiwick. I'm some guy on the internet. And of those, most had unique email addresses, so we had comparatively few people completing the same thing twice. I gave about $400 in promotional credit through DriveThruRPG as an enticement for participate. Thank you to DriveThruRPG, who provided these to me at a discount. So thanks, folks. If you would like to support me and the work we do, there should be a link for an affiliate to DriveThruRPG listed with this video. If you click on that and buy something, you can help me recover the roughly $300 I spent on those gift cards. So, yeah. We also got relatively few asshat responses, so I'm pretty glad about that. And most of them could be chalked up to either English not being someone's primary language or somebody just misunderstanding a question. So I'm viewing that as an idea that most of the people responded in good-ish faith. So, as I said, this is going to be looking at World of Darkness only. I will do a separate one for Chronicles of Darkness once I get some feedback on this video, and maybe I'll do a combined one distilling everything down. The results are generally grouped by line, which we defined as Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, Changeling, Wraith, Demon, Hunter, and Mummy. We lumped the hardbacks and period books like Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom and Mage Sorcerer's Crusade with what we called their parent line, and we also chose not to specifically address Orpheus. We had a few responses that suggested that people were answering for Orpheus, but not enough that I think it's going to be a thing. We also didn't include a I play everything option, as many people do crossovers, nor did we include a Mortals World of Darkness option, as one doesn't easily exist as compared to Chronicles of Darkness, but sorry to all the fans of World of Darkness Sorcerer out there. So, simple question, what was the most common game? And we did this by asking, what did you buy in the last year? The survey that we ran finished in early 2020, so it covers something like calendar year 2019, so January 2019 to January 2020. As you can see, to the surprise of no one, Vampire is in the lead, with almost 3/4 of respondents having bought a Vampire the Masquerade supplement. For reference, Camarilla and Anarch had been released just prior to the window of the survey, which may have bumped things up. Also, Mage and Wraith had releases within those windows, with Gods and Monsters having been printed in the April of that window, and Wraith having had Book of Oblivion coming out in August of 2019. Additionally, we looked at, hey, if you only play one game, what game is it? And if you only bought one game, chances are it was Vampire. As it goes down, it becomes less and less likely that you are only playing what line, my favorite being the fact that nobody just plays Mummy the Resurrection. So, yeah. Also, you'll notice throughout this, I don't use pie charts because I hate pie charts. Also, my heart goes out to the one person who bought Hunter the Reckoning content and nothing else, as well as to the lone buyer of Demon the Fallen. You two should swap email addresses. One of my questions was, is there a secret kindred connection between, say, Wraith and Changeling players or Mage and Demon players? And I think this is actually more of an artifact of people who just buy multiple lines. So once you get out of just playing Vampire, the odds that you play and buy more than one line really starts to increase. So in this chart, we look at the question of, given that you bought this book, what are the odds that they also bought one of these? So looking here, given that you bought a Werewolf the Apocalypse book, there's an 85% chance that you also bought a Vampire the Masquerade book. And you can kind of see as you go down that the odds of crossover increase. For instance, given that you bought a Mummy the Resurrection book, the odds that you bought a Demon the Fallen book are quite high. We didn't really find many secret cross-line correlations that are not explained by the phenomenon of people just being multi-line gamers. Once you get outside of the big three, so Vampire, Werewolf, and Mage, the odds that you bought from several lines really starts to increase. And we show this across the bottom. So for instance, your average person who bought a book for Mummy the Resurrection bought from, in total, 6.5 lines roughly. And likewise with Hunter the Reckoning and Demon the Fallen. My peeps in Mage in generally are buying 4 lines. So again, as you go down, your odds of buying from multiple lines is just increasing. And I think that's what kind of causes that. There are no huge numbers that really really leap out here. I mean, there is a slight bump for Changeling the Dreaming and Wraith, and you can look at that both ways, but I mean, there's a tie between Mummy the Resurrection and Changeling, so I'm not going to read into that too much. Also, to some extent, there's only so much conclusion you can draw from 1,100 responses. I think there are some useful conclusions you can draw, but I don't know how powerful any given one is. To drive the cross-line purchases home, here's a chart of how many lines people purchased. The average respondent bought from 2.5 lines, and that includes 0 as an option. If you ask, given you bought 1 line, how many did you buy from? The answer becomes almost 3. Demon, Mummy, and Hunter have a fair amount of correlation because they're more likely to be purchased by super buyers, people who are buying 6 or more lines. If you were to meet a Mummy the Resurrection player, there's a pretty good odds that they're a super player or a super buyer and that they're getting all sorts of stuff, and that's kind of what this chart shows here. So again, given that you are playing Mummy, you have probably bought from almost 6.5 lines in addition to Mummy. Pardon me. You've bought from 6.5 lines, including Mummy. So again, the phenomenon where certain lines seem to have unusual cross-buying is probably due to this super buyer phenomenon. Another question I had is if the number of games you bought was correlated with the average rating that you gave, and it is kind of up to a point, it shouldn't be too surprising that as the number of games you buy increase, more or less, your average rating of the World of Darkness on the whole tends to increase, and that shouldn't exactly be a surprise. One of my next big questions was, who was buying more stuff, players or storytellers? And in my head, storytellers were generally buying supplements and then using them at their tables, but the gap between the number of players who bought and the percentage of STs who bought was lower than I thought. This is partially because there's a likely asymmetry between players and STs. So while a player and a storyteller may buy a book in a given year, a storyteller will likely buy more. Again, we didn't ask questions about volume. And this leads to an interesting result where, again, assuming that they're buying equal volumes, if we flip the question on its head and say, given that a supplement was bought, was it more likely to have been bought by a player or a storyteller? The answer is player. So while more STs are buying as a percentage of storytellers, there are simply a lot more players than there are storytellers, and that kind of makes up that difference. When we look at the storyteller vault, this gap tends to drop considerably. So it suggests that on the storyteller vault, at least, there's a good mix between players and storytellers doing the buying. I was struck at the number of people who were buying that had purchased something from the storyteller vault. In this case, a little bit more than 50% reported buying a community content title of some sort. So why are the actual sales volumes on the storyteller vault low, at least in the eyes of STV authors? Response could be the fact that the survey was answered by more engaged people. So even if within the survey the two aren't that different, the fact that overall there are more players that are buying maybe one copy of something from DriveThruRPG or something from their local game store, that's obviously not being mirrored with the storyteller vault. It could be the fact that there are more official supplements. So as a percentage, that given that someone bought from one as well as the other, their purchase of licensed media could be vastly higher than what they're buying through the storyteller vault. And also this could be a questioning error, that when we say, have you used the Storyteller Vault, on the Storyteller Vault, when you go to storytellervault.com, you can also get the actual publications in addition to community content stuff. So we have no idea how many people were getting regular titles through the Storyteller Vault as opposed to things that were community content only. It does suggest, though, that people at least know what the Storyteller Vault is, and a fair number of people have in some way engaged with it. So now that we have an idea of what the buying is, this is where things get interesting to me. How many people bought something but don't play that line? So how many people do you have that are buying something for a game that they are not playing? Except for Vampire the Masquerade, between 20 and 30% of buys are coming from people that haven't actually played that game in the last year. This could be either from people who are curious in a game and are using that to get into it, or from people who have lapsed in their gaming. These non-playing buyers could be collectors, lapsed players, people interested in a game, or people interested in the lore but who aren't playing. I'm certainly guilty of being that. Just a note, these are people who bought a line. This doesn't in any way get normalized numerically. So the 14% of people who bought a vampire book and didn't play are much larger than the 26% of werewolf buyers who didn't play, again, because there are so many more vampire players. So this slide is in the context of all people who bought one or more book for the Old World of Darkness. So of the 1,100 responses, that's roughly 961 people. And we asked them, did you try and play the game in the year? Of respondents, most have played Vampire, and most want to play more Vampire, which I say good for them. 3/4 of people plan to buy a Vampire book of some sort, and a whopping half to plan on buying something from the Storyteller Vault. Now, this table includes 2 columns of note. The second is couldn't find group, which means somebody who wanted to play, but they couldn't find anyone to play with. The next group is a wants to try column, meaning someone who is interested but may or may not have put any effort into finding a group. Some things that leapt out at me. Mage the Ascension has a really high wants to try rate, and this is of all respondents, so this is not in any way normalized. This means that 65% of that 961 people said that they wanted to try Mage, so go Mage team. Demon the Fallen is almost as desired as Changeling, and is more desired than Wraith. So if you're interested in getting Demon to be played, there's probably a fair number of people who are also interested. For all lines but Vampire, more respondents said that they were interested in buying a book than actually were playing the game. So that means that of people who buy, most are not players. If our goal, again, is to get more butts and seats, that represents a huge amount of latent demand for that. Now let's look at this in table form, and it kind of makes it apparent what some of these high points are. There's our everyone wants to try Mage. Here's the fact that everyone is playing Vampire. Also that it is much easier to find a group for Vampire compared to all other things, so that's good to know. And now we're going to explore that idea of latent demand, or latent interest, the high wants to try and high couldn't find a group, in a little more detail. If we look at the wants to play or couldn't find groups as a ratio of people who wanted to play to people who were playing, we see the size of the latent demand. 5 times as many people want to play Mummy as there are people who purportedly actually played Mummy. Now, mind you, that could be 5 people and 1 people. This is normalized to the number of people who've played the line, so you get some pretty large effects with small numbers, but still, it suggests that the ratio of those two are way off. This is probably a sign that something like curated play is a good idea. Curated play is when a company or storyteller group offers, usually for some fee, to run a game. The best known, I think, is probably Magpie Games' curated play program, which has proven reasonably successful. For more information on that, just look at the notes below, and I'll include a link there. So I'm going to take the fact that we are halfway through to kind of have a big takeaway. If you love a game, the best thing you can do is run that game. There are people who are probably interested in it in some way, shape, or form. This isn't to say that you're changing the Dreaming game, which is loosely based on like William Blake mythology and blended with Harry Dresden, is instantly going to fill up, but there is some version of your game that a lot of people want to play. Even at the low end, 1 in 5 people wanted to try Mummy. So yeah, there's a pretty hopping group that is looked to do it. Sign up for an online convention, run it once or twice, make a cheat sheet, give it to your players. I am regularly able to run one-shots for Mage with people who have never played a World of Darkness game and do a short adventure in under 4 hours. Seriously, go run your game for people. That is the best way to expand it. Anyway, back to other things. So we have a bunch of data, and we want to predict who is buying. This tries to show the relationship between people who did buy a supplement from a line and other World of Darkness gaming once. Each line is normalized to the number of people who bought a publication for that line, which is why the did buy column is at 100 for everything. So the question is, what are the best predictors of what somebody is going to buy? And when we start looking through that, it becomes very quickly apparent that of people who did buy something in the last year, the best predictor is somebody who listed as wanting to try a game. Now, this could go either way. It could be the fact that somebody was interested in a game and bought it, or somebody bought a game and then became interested in it. We really can't infer causality. But it is interesting that this wants to try is higher than people who actually played or who had already bought from the Storyteller Vault. This may be due to the fact that people who already are playing the game likely have all the supplements they want, but it does suggest that a fair amount of purchases are coming from people who are just kind of curious. And if we can expand that market, that's going to be our best way of introducing people to games and likely increasing sales. And again, I am not here on behalf of White Wolf Paradox or Onyx Path. I am just someone who is interested in having that community grow. I also looked at this question in terms of looking on who plans to buy. And if we instead fix on the plans to buy group, again, wants to try becomes the highest predictor again. And that relationship becomes even stronger. So our loosely interested or lightly interested people who haven't necessarily tried to find a group and haven't necessarily played tends to be our biggest pool of buyers. So one of the questions we also asked was, how much of officially published material in the World of Darkness should be spent on nuanced and respectful presentation of underrepresented real-world communities, whether cultural, religious, gender, or sexual in nature? And this was us just kind of being curious. And of the respondents, about 20% said that White Wolf or World of Darkness was paying too much attention to this or was giving it more time than was necessary. 42% thinks that it's a little bit less, with the remaining not being sure or thinking that it was about okay. On the whole, that suggests that they need to spend a little bit more time on this. Again, this may be just the fact that it is from people who are in communities that already have strong feelings to that, but at the same time, if somebody thinks it is insufficient and has been pushed away, that person also didn't respond, so that could actually be dragging the acceptability up in comparison. This is a really hard mix to land, and I wish the writers the best of luck in doing so. One of the other things we looked at was LARPing, which is live action role playing. And looking at LARPing, I think, is important because it's another venue to get people involved in tabletop gaming. It does not have the same baggage associated with it. It has different baggage associated with it, but importantly, it is not the same of people sitting around a table, throwing dice in an attempt to kill dragons or what have you, or whatever the kids are doing these days. It is also a venue where the normal ratio of players to storytellers change, and a small group of story runners can serve many more people in a lot of cases, which I think is also an interesting thing if you ultimately believe that the finite number of storytellers is kind of what is restricting access to the hobby. All data collection was done before COVID began, so there should not be any COVID you can't LARP data artifacts. We didn't have as strong reach into LARP communities. We had several people that we reached out to that were willing to pass on the information to their groups, so this may reflect more tabletop players who also LARPed versus LARPers who also played tabletop. Interesting fact from this to me is 26% of people are kind of curious about LARPing, that they've never done it before but are interested in trying it. Hopefully post-COVID we can get more information on that. Interestingly, something like 36% of people had no interest in LARPing or had sworn it off. But still, 2/3 of people being involved or being interested from this, again, suggests that there is a large pool for LARP communities. We also asked given that somebody LARPed, most LARPers spent more time playing tabletop versus LARPing. Only 3% of respondents were strictly LARPers that did little to no tabletop playing, although there is some demand for LARP content on the Storyteller Vault. We haven't seen a huge amount of this, but it suggests that there is a latent market that could be tapped by people who are writing supplements of that type. We also asked what kind of LARP system you used. There are two large ones. You have the old Laws of that were released in the 90s and 2000s, and then the more contemporary Mind's Eye Theater rules that were put out by By Night Studios. Of the 350 or so people who responded, By Night Studios was generally more popular. Both equally. I accidentally allowed Other to be an option, and I did not know in Google Forms that if you click Other, it automatically makes it a free response. On the downside, this made going through the data vastly more difficult, as I had now several hundreds of free response enters to go to. But on the plus side, I got some real gems, including someone who played the custom system with a K. I don't know if that's actually a thing. my heart goes out to the people who said that they just use the tabletop rules and use die rollers on their phones, which doesn't actually sound too bad. Someone said that they liked LARPing, but they really wish there was a way with more structure where you didn't have to be in costume. Someone please find this person and tell them that tabletop gaming existed. Some person indicated that their LARP rule was just exalted. I don't know if this is a remarkably high energy, Wuxia informed version of like Vampire out there, or that they were doing an exalted LARP. Whatever it is, sounds awesome. Someone indicated that they were using house rules called Laws of the Hunt. Please, no one tell them that that's already a thing. The one that I found distressing is we don't use rules. Story is more important than rules. And I'm like, I really hope they at least have an X card mechanic. Otherwise, I'm going to get real uncomfortable real fast. Anyway, back onto what people want. In this section, we're back to the World of Darkness, and we asked people what kind of books and materials that they wanted to see published. We gave the options of setting, which is location books or historical period books, systems, which is abilities, powers, character systems, and other mechanically geared things. Metaplot, in-game events that change the setting over time. This is kind of distinct from just a location book where things happen. Fiction, which are publications set in the World of Darkness, but that don't necessarily tie to a game action. Pre-made or pre-generated characters, art, gameplay props, aids, things that will assist you while playing at the table, or prepared stories and pre-made chronicles. The line between some of these can get kind of blurry, but looking at what already exists, these seemed kind of like natural groups. So what did people say that they wanted? This is a big old chart, and the important thing to notice is the more blue something had, the less interested people were. The more orange it was had, or further to the right, the more interested people were in it. And to my STV bros, this is probably the one chart that kind of dominates over everything. I also looked at it by line, and the outcome became a little bit blurrier, but were largely consistent. So it is possible that more people were interested in a changeling art book than people that were interested in a wraith art book or something like that. But I figure the high level takeaway is what I would focus on. If you're interested in more of the specifics, by all means, reach out to me. We can do something. So we asked people to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 was least interested and 5 was most interested. So the higher the column to a right is in any given set of charts, the more interested people were in it. And I'm just going to list kind of 5 of my takeaways. People love setting books and systems and powers. So setting books, pretty high. Systems and powers, also pretty high. People really don't want pre-made characters. That kind of makes sense. Art, prop, and fiction were kind of on the mess side. There is a healthy interest in play references and metaplot write-ups, as well as pre-made campaigns. This is kind of interesting in that pre-made campaigns didn't come out highly here, but later when we asked what do you wish existed, pre-made campaigns and chronicles were one of the most consistent things that people said that they wanted. But again, no one seemingly wants pre-made characters. Wow, that's really not enjoyed. So here's the chart. Here's another way of looking at it where we normalize it, where 1 means that measures that it had average desire, and below 1 means less than average desire. So we took the average rank for each of these types. We normalized it to be 1 being true average. If it's above that, more than the average number of people liked it. If it's below that, less than the average number of people liked it. So again, this just kind of reiterates what I said before. Pre-made characters, this value is very much below 1, not too popular. Setting and systems and powers above, relatively popular, as well as play references. Pre-made campaigns come out a little bit above, as does metaplot. But fiction, art, and props, not hugely desired by people. Does this mean that if you have an idea for doing an art book that you shouldn't do it? No, just that there isn't a lot of stated demand. I also fully understand that a lot of people don't realize what they want until they see it. So there probably is room to upset this with a really great hunter prop book or a piece of demon fiction or something like that. Again, this is just what people purported to say that they wanted. There was also a free response section, and boy howdy did I get some free responses. We gave a place for people to just say what they wanted, and I sorted through the 736 responses that we got, and people have strong opinions. Almost 100 requested V5 stuff, but I can't do that on the Storyteller Vault, and something tells me that White Wolf and Paradox are probably already familiar with people wanting that, so I largely ignored it. Of those, there were a lot of requests of people to bring back their favorite clan, bloodline, or discipline to V5. The next most popular request was to see 5th editions of Mage and Werewolf, followed by the other lines. Again, that is all in the hands of Paradox/White Wolf, so whenever that happens, awesome sauce. From there, we got a whole bunch of requests for things that already existed. Someone asked for a book on the Umbra, which between Infinite Tapestry, Book of Worlds, Umbra the Velvet Shadow, Umbra the Velvet Shadow Revised, and Umbra the Velvet Shadow 20th Anniversary Edition, there are at least 5 books on the Umbra, and that ignores the entirety of the Wraith line. Someone asked for a Changeling 20th Anniversary Edition core. I hope that person has found out that it is out there and it exists, and if you do, please use my drive-thru RPG affiliate link. Shots fired. Someone said a book to replace the swill that was Wraith 20. Okay, strong feelings. Someone make a pathos roll. Now, of the responses that are more actionable, these are listed in order of popularity. A pre-made chronicle for all lines. This also included crossover chronicle requests. There were at least 8 people who individually said, hey, I would love to have a big Old World of Darkness crossover book. Chronicle that is independent from a book of crossover, which either gives crossover rules or recommendations on crossover metaplot. By far, the next highest request of things that were actually actionable was a 20th Anniversary Edition of Demon the Fallen, followed by a 20th Anniversary Edition of Kindred of the East. That one kind of surprised me. Another big thing was an update on Mage the Ascension Splat books. This included both traditions and crafts. One of the other things that was very commonly requested was a book on the Disparate Alliance. So fingers crossed for that in some form happening. Again, even if Paradox isn't going to do it, there's nothing stopping a Storyteller Vault developer from making that exist. A Werewolf the Apocalypse Mockery Breeds book included some... there was also a general request for Werewolf the Apocalypse breed books, including a few very specific things, like a option for more Mockery breeds, or specifically an update to breed book Noisha. Hunter the Reckoning also had a fair number of requests, and there's a whole bunch of requests for what I will call Asia books but better, which were things like, we want to see the Hissien, but we want them to make sense, or an alternative to the Hissien in East Asia, or Kindred of the East but without the different origin stories, or an alternative to the Yellow Springs. There were a few of these, so I thought I should at least note it, that people like non-US content, but maybe we need to update that to 21st century sensibilities. Other honorable mentions were a city books for outside the US, city books for inside the US that aren't Chicago, and an update to Chicago. At this point, V5 Chicago was already in the works, so again, hopefully that person finds out that it's there. A couple people wanted a big book of equipment and rules for it, which that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to exist. Information on the underworlds outside of the US. At the time of the survey, the Book of Oblivion had come out relatively recently, so people may not have just been aware to it. People wanted metaplot updates, way to advance what had happened in the world for most of the X20 lines, and some very specific requests, including Richard Dansky's Ferryman book, which, I mean, there's information on the Ferryman inside Ends of Empire, so I don't know if that counts, as well as Rose Bailey's Dev Notes. Rose Bailey has done a number of specific publications in the Storyteller Vault for Chronicles of Darkness. I'm not quite sure if they're looking for something more specific than that. So, after we asked about what books people wanted to see, we were curious about what other media that they wanted to see. So we asked them, have you seen a live play or an actual play? Have you watched or heard a book review? Or have you watched or heard a tutorial or a how-to? And more than half players who had responded, more than half of the people who had responded had watched or listened to a live play or an actual play. And in addition to that, we asked people how they'd feel watching or listening to the following: live play or actual play, author interviews, tutorials, or reviews. And this table kind of shows how that responded for each line. Again, this is of all respondents. So over half of all respondents were interested in looking at a Vampire the Masquerade live play, followed by reviews, tutorials, and interviews. And anything that is listed in bold, at least a third of people purported to be interested in. So that's a VTM live play review, tutorial, or interview, a Werewolf the Apocalypse live play, a Mage the Ascension live play review or tutorial. And that's about it for the third mark. So the three biggest lines. Not really a surprise. Now, in chart form, this is kind of what it looks like. Again, this is percentage of all respondents. Live plays, generally the most popular, followed by reviews, then tutorials, then authors. Dat latent interest in Demon again. That's a little bit shy of a quarter. And Wraith and Changeling are something about neck and neck in terms of overall interest. So this is my weird math slide where I look at these results and I say, how does it go compared to the size of the player base? If you compare the lines played to those interested in the media about it, the less popular a line is, proportionately more people are curious about it. This is likely a fair amount of cross-line interest in that once you're interested in the World of Darkness, you're probably curious at least a little bit in watching a Mummy the Resurrection game. But this is something that we kind of knew, and more or less maybe a commentary on how few people play. But you'll notice that, again, in many cases, there are more people interested in learning about a line than actually play that line. So, again, a huge amount of latent interest. My guess is many of these people who have that latent interest can be turned into people who are curious, who are ultimately going to buy books, and hopefully ultimately play the game. Because, hey, who doesn't like playing games? So those are kind of the main numerical findings. So let's talk a little bit about who responded. And this is kind of the demographic breakdown. Our request regarding gender identity was a response where you could have male, female, non-binary, other, and you could fill it in however that you wanted to. Or whatever you care to say that you are, that was fine by us. 75% of respondents identified as male. So 3/4. The remaining were female or indicated that they were non-binary or other. We know it's a male-dominated hobby, and this is just kind of further proof that it is, especially for the World of Darkness. Now, if we compare that to age-wise, our average player is roughly a 34-year-old male, coming out with something like a little bit shy of 30% of all respondents. The average female or non-binary player is about 32, so a little bit younger. And this is partially driven by the fact that vampire players are more likely to be younger and more likely to be female or non-binary. So vampire is doing a slightly better job at getting a younger and more gender diverse demographic. Interestingly, also, female and non-binary players were more spread out in terms of age makeup. They were more likely to be under 20 as well as over 40. So a bit more spread there. I looked at this on a Chronicles of Darkness versus World of Darkness basis. Very hard to separate. There's a lot of crossplay there, and I didn't see anything obvious to say that one was younger or more male or female or non-binary than the other. I was able to find some demographic information for Dungeons and Dragons. And again, as I said, there was no strong correlation between lines and genders and ages, except that Vampire is slightly less male biased and slightly younger. I found some information on Dungeons & Dragons, and based on the numbers released by WotC, based on a large consumer survey, 40% of D&D players are under 25 versus 19 or so for World of Darkness, and 11% of D&D players are over 40 versus 22% for World of Darkness. 39% of D&D players identify as female versus something like 16% for the World of Darkness. Again, this assumes that our survey was in any way representative, and there could be vast swathes of young female and non-binary players out there who simply didn't know about it, and theoretically more so than there are male players who didn't know about it. But we're running with what we have, and here's my link to the survey that WotC distributed. So where to next? Many of the conclusions reinforced things that most people who've been around the community already know, but even that is useful when we say that Vampire is really popular and then Mage and Werewolf in a distant second and third. It's good to note the degree to which that is true. If we're going to do this again, I want to get more information on play history, probably asking a set of questions based on have you ever, as well as what about in the past, say, 3 years or something like that, just to kind of have a better idea of how things are going. Right now, we're treating someone who never played and somebody who didn't play in the last year as the same. We probably should have also asked how people are playing, whether that be home games, online, at conventions, at in-person LARPs, some other way of doing it, play by post, Discord, what have you. And more information on past purchases, some indication of volume to talk about what portion of people are very light buyers versus heavy buyers. Again, it would probably be hard to get information about light buyers. They're probably less likely to be involved in an online community. That's just a guess. And we're also ignoring downstream effects. Like a person who buys $1,000 in a year is the same as, pardon me. So if you ignore downstream effects like word of mouth, a person who buys $1,000 in a year is the same in the eyes of the company as 20 people buying a $50 source book. So again, is it a small number of heavy buyers or a much larger number of medium buyers? And what is kind of that distribution? That's the end of it. Again, my overall points: write some play aids, power references, and city guides. Demon has huge latent interest. Go run a game you like for strangers. And someone please put out a Wraith the Oblivion or Demon or Demon the Fallen live play. It probably has a market. No one seemingly likes even the least enjoyed line, Mummy. 20% of people are in some way interested in seeing something about it, and holy shit, people want to try Mage. So yeah, if you found this useful, comment, get in touch with me. Maybe we run this again, and we go from there. Thanks for your time, and thanks for looking at my presentation.